He thought the shadow emerging from the blizzard was a predator coming to end his old friend's life. But he didn't realize that in the wild, sometimes the smallest soul carries the greatest shield. The Yukon does not forgive. In the northernmost reaches of the territory, where the trees grow stunted and twisted by the wind, winter isn't just a season. It is a sentient weight. It presses against the glass of the windows, it screams through the floorboards, and it waits for any sign of weakness. Inside a cabin built of heavy cedar and grit, 78-year-old Elias Thorne sat by a hearth that was losing its battle against the cold. His hands, gnarled like the roots of the spruce trees outside, shook as he added the last of the dry birch to the flames. But Elias wasn't looking at the fire. His eyes were fixed on the rug by the door where Koda lay. Koda was a German shepherd whose name had once been spoken with reverence in every rescue station from White Horse to Dawson City. In his prime, Koda was a titan, 100 pounds of muscle and instinct who had pulled 7 people from avalanches and tracked lost hikers through miles of trackless taiga. Now, Koda was 14, an age that felt like a century for a dog of his size. Time had stolen the fire from his amber eyes, replacing it with the milky veil of cataracts. His hips, once capable of leaping over fallen logs in a single bound, were now locked in the cruel grip of advanced arthritis. Every time Koda tried to shift his weight, a low, wet whimper escaped his throat, a sound that cut through Elias's heart deeper than the cold. "Easy, old man," Elias whispered, his voice raspy from disuse. "The storm will break by morning." It always does, but the storm showed no signs of breaking. Outside, the white death, a blizzard so thick you couldn't see your own hand, was burying the cabin. The temperature had dropped to 40 below, and for the first time in 40 years, the cabin's ancient wood-burning stove felt inadequate. The wind found the tiny gaps in the doorframe, sending plumes of snow skittering across the floor like ghostly insects. Koda shivered. It wasn't the rhythmic shaking of a cold dog. It was the violent, irregular tremors of a body that no longer had the fuel to keep itself warm. His breathing was shallow, a faint whistling sound in the silence of the room. Elias knew the signs. He had seen enough life pass in the wilderness to know when the candle was flickering at the very bottom of the wick. Suddenly, Koda's ears, one of which was notched from a fight with a lynx years ago, twitched. Elias froze. Koda was nearly deaf, yet the dog's head lifted an inch off the floor. His nose, dry and cracked, worked the air. A low, ancestral growl started deep in Koda's chest, but it broke into a cough. Thump! Something had hit the door. Not the soft brush of a snowdrift, but a deliberate, heavy impact. Elias reached for the shotgun, leaning against the mantel, his heart hammering against his ribs. A grizzly should be hibernating. A wolf pack wouldn't approach a human dwelling with a fire going. He moved toward the door, his own knees aching, and peered through the small, frosted porthole window. At first, there was only white. Then, a flash of something darker. A pair of eyes, not amber like Koda's, but a piercing, electric yellow, stared back through the glass. It was a fox, but not the common red foxes that scavenged near the town. This was a silver fox, a rare, melanistic shadow of the forest. Its fur was a shimmering charcoal, tipped with frost, making it look like a creature made of moonlight and soot. The fox was smaller than a wolf, but it stood with a strange, desperate defiance. It wasn't attacking, it was heaving. Its ribs were visible through its matted fur. It was an outcast, an orphan of the storm, looking for the only source of heat for 50 miles. "Get on now," Elias shouted, thumping the wood of the door. The fox didn't move. It let out a high-pitched, warbling cry, a sound so full of loneliness and cold that it mirrored the grief Elias felt for his dying dog. Elias looked back at Koda. The old shepherd had stopped growling. He was watching the door with his clouded eyes, his tail giving one single, weak thump against the floor. It wasn't a warning. In the strange language of animals, Koda had recognized a fellow traveler at the end of the road. Elias looked at the thermometer inside the window. The mercury was plummeting. If he left the fox out there, it would be a frozen statue by midnight. If he opened the door, he risked the safety of his home. With a sigh of resignation, Elias threw the heavy iron bolt and pulled. The wind roared into the cabin like a physical blow, dousing the kerosene lamp and sending sparks flying from the hearth. In the chaos of swirling white, the silver shadow slipped inside. Elias slammed the door shut, gasping for breath, and quickly relit the lamp. He held the light up, expecting to see the fox cowering in a corner or raiding the pantry. Instead, he saw something that defied every law of the wild. The fox, whom Elias would later name Malakai, had walked straight to the rug. It didn't snap at Koda. It didn't act like a predator. It moved with a ghostly, silent grace, sniffing the air around the old dog's head. Koda didn't move. He closed his eyes, his breathing heavy. Malakai, the wild silver fox, circled the large dog twice. Then, with a soft, chittering sound, the fox tucked its head under Koda's chin and pressed its warm, thick-furred body against the dog's trembling chest. The shivering didn't stop immediately, but the rhythm changed. The fox began to lick the frost from Koda's ears, its tongue a small, pink rasp of life. Koda let out a long, shuddering sigh, not of pain, but of relief. The heat from the fox's dense, wild coat began to seep into the dog's arthritic joints. Elias stood there, the shotgun forgotten in his hand. He watched as the predator and the protector became a single pile of fur in the amber light of the fire. "Well," Elias whispered, sinking into his chair, "I suppose you found your own rescue, Koda." He didn't know it then, but the arrival of the silver fox wasn't just a fluke of the storm. It was the beginning of a pact. Over the next few days, as the blizzard buried the cabin to the eaves, Malakai would not leave Koda's side. He would become the ears for the dog who couldn't hear, the eyes for the dog who couldn't see, and the fire for the dog whose heart was growing cold. But as the food ran low and the shadows in the forest grew hungry, the true test of this bond was yet to come. For in the Yukon, nothing is given for free, and the silver fox had brought more than just warmth into the house. He had brought a secret from the deep woods that was following close behind him. The morning light that filtered through the frost-thickened windows of the cabin was a pale, sickly gray. The blizzard had not stopped. It had simply settled into a rhythmic, relentless howl that shook the cedar logs to their foundations. Inside, the hearth was a heap of glowing embers, and the air held a sharp, metallic chill. Elias woke in his armchair, his neck stiff and his breath blooming in a white cloud. His first instinct was to check the rug. He half expected to find that the previous night had been a fever dream, a hallucination brought on by the cold and the grief of watching his best friend fade away. But as the shadows retreated, the reality was even more staggering. Koda was still there, but he looked different. For the first time in weeks, the old German shepherd's chest was rising and falling in a deep, rhythmic slumber, free of the frantic, shallow gasps that had plagued him. Curled tightly against his flank was Malakai. The silver fox's charcoal fur was intertwined with Koda's tan and black coat, creating a living fortress of warmth. Malakai's ears, tipped with frost, twitched as Elias shifted in his chair, but the fox did not flee. Instead, he lifted his head and fixed Elias with a steady, unblinking yellow gaze, a look that held no fear, only a quiet, fierce pride, as if to say, "I have him now." The ritual of the bowls. As the day progressed, Elias witnessed the first of many overturnings of the natural law. He went to the kitchen to prepare their morning meal. For Koda, it was a bowl of softened kibble mixed with warm broth to help his failing appetite. For the visitor, Elias placed a separate dish of raw venison scraps he had kept in the cold cellar. In the wild, the young and strong eat first, leaving the scraps for the weak. But as Elias placed the bowls on the floor, Malakai did not rush forward. The fox stood up, his lean body elegant and alert, and waited. He sat like a stone guardian as Koda struggled to rise, his back legs trembling. Koda moved with the slowness of a glacier, his joints clicking in the silence. He reached his bowl and began to eat with a renewed vigor, sparked perhaps by the presence of his new companion. Only when Koda had finished his last bite and stepped away did Malakai lower his head to his own meal. It was a ritual of profound reverence, a recognition of the old dog's status that felt almost sacred. The living radar. By mid-afternoon, it became clear that Malakai had understood Koda's limitations with a speed that surpassed human intuition. Koda's blindness had turned the small cabin into a minefield of sharp corners and heavy furniture. Usually, the old dog would bump into the legs of the table or become disoriented in the shadows, letting out a frustrated whine. Elias watched from the kitchen as Koda rose to go to the water bowl. Malakai immediately stood and positioned himself on Koda's left side, the side where the dog's cataract was most severe. The fox didn't push or pull. He acted as a living radar. When Koda drifted too close to the edge of the wood stove, Malakai would lean his weight against the dog's shoulder, gently nudging him back onto the safe path. When they reached the water bowl, Malakai didn't drink. He used his nose to nudge the bowl toward Koda, ensuring the old dog didn't have to search for it. It was as if they had become a single organism, the fox providing the senses, the dog providing the soul. The sentinel at the threshold. As the sun, what little was visible of it, began to dip below the horizon, Malakai's behavior changed. He stopped his grooming of Koda's ears and became a sentinel. He moved to the door, pressing his nose against the gap where the wind whistled through. His fur bristled, and a low, vibrating sound, not quite a growl, but a warning, rippled through his chest. Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. He knew that foxes were often the hunted, not the hunters, in these woods. Malakai wasn't just guarding the cabin. He was hiding from something. Elias looked out the window. Through the swirling white, he saw a movement at the edge of the tree line. It was a dark, heavy shape, much larger than a fox or a dog. It stayed perfectly still, a shadow within shadows, watching the cabin with a patience that was terrifying. Malakai turned back to Koda, who had noticed the tension and was trying to stand, his notched ear swiveling toward the door. The fox let out a soft, reassuring chitter and pressed his forehead against Koda's, a gesture of absolute trust. Then, Malakai returned to his position at the threshold, lying in a sphinx-like pose, his golden eyes fixed on the darkness. He had sacrificed his freedom and the safety of the deep forest to stay by the side of a dying dog. But as the shadows outside drew closer, Elias realized that this silver guardian might be the only thing standing between them and the ancient hunger of the Yukon night. This is part 3 of the Silver Guardian. In this chapter, the bond between the aging protector and the young wild spirit evolves into a sophisticated partnership of survival, mirroring the deep devotion found in the history of Rook and Barnaby. Part 3. The Sovereign of Shadows. The third night of the deep freeze brought a silence, so absolute it felt heavy. The wind had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a world buried under 6 feet of crystalline white. Inside the cabin, the air was stagnant and frigid. Elias had moved his mattress to the floor by the hearth, unable to bear the thought of being away from Koda, as the dog's life force seemed to ebb with the falling mercury. Koda's condition had taken a sharp turn. His arthritis, aggravated by the extreme drop in pressure, had essentially locked his rear legs. He lay in his wicker basket, his beige and black fur looking thin, like age parchment. Every shallow breath he took released a faint mist into the air, a flickering signal of a life nearing its end. The healing tongue. Elias watched through the dim firelight as Malakai, the silver fox, began a ritual of incredible tenderness. Recognizing that Koda could no longer groom himself, Malakai took on the task without hesitation. With his small, rough tongue, he spent hours cleaning the old dog's face and the notched ear that Koda could no longer reach. Elias noticed that as the fox groomed him, Koda began to emit a low, rumbling hum, not a growl, but a deep vibration of contentment. It was a form of therapy. The low frequency seemed to soothe the old dog's aching joints. Malakai was using his own wildlife force to cushion the pain of Koda's old age. The mock hunt. As the days of the freeze turned into a week, Koda's spirit began to flag. He felt the frustration of a retired king who could no longer survey his kingdom. Sensing this loss of dignity, Malakai invented a game. The fox would venture into the crawl space of the cabin or the woodpile and retrieve a dried maple leaf or a stray pheasant feather. He would drop it directly in front of Koda's nose and, with a gentle tap of his paw, make it skitter across the floorboards. Koda, stirred by the ancient instinct of the hunt, would swipe at it with a slow, heavy paw. Though the fox could have caught the prey in a heartbeat, Malakai would leap backward dramatically, tumbling over as if struck by a thunderous blow from a legendary hunter. Koda would lift his head, his chest puffed with a fleeting moment of pride, believing he still held the strength of his youth. In those moments, Malakai showed the tenderness of strength that knows when to bow to an elder. The living step. The most moving display of their partnership occurred when Koda tried to reach his favorite spot, the old, cushioned armchair by the window where the winter sun hit the glass. Koda's trembling legs could no longer manage the jump. He scratched weakly at the wood, his tail drooping in frustration. Malakai, observing from the shadows, did not leap up to take the seat for himself. Instead, he rose silently and lowered his body flat against the floor beside the chair, forming a solid, living step. Koda understood. He stepped onto the fox's broad, muscular back, using the wild creature as a brace to climb into the chair. Once Koda was settled, the fox hopped up and curled around the dog's paws, both of them gazing out at the pine forest as the sun set. The shadow revealed. However, the peace was an illusion. The shadow Elias had seen at the tree line was no longer content to watch. One afternoon, while Elias was outside clearing the vent for the wood stove, the silence of the porch was broken. Koda was sleeping in a patch of pale yellow sunlight, unaware of the predatory eyes watching from the frozen brambles. Because of his deafness and clouded vision, Koda did not hear the crunch of snow beneath careful, heavy steps. It was a lone timber wolf, its coat matted and gray, ribs stark beneath the skin. It was a scavenger turned desperate by a winter of scarcity. The wolf saw only an elderly, motionless dog, an easy gift of calories. It lowered its body, yellow eyes locking onto Koda's throat, and coiled to leap. Elias saw the movement from the corner of his eye and screamed, but he was too far away, his legs feeling like lead in the deep snow. Just as the wolf launched into the air, a silver shadow dropped from the roof of the porch like judgment from the sky. Malakai had been perched on the strategic lookout he had inherited from Koda's prime days, watching the world all afternoon. There was no warning cry. Malakai released himself into a free fall, turning his entire weight into a weapon. He struck the wolf mid-air, a brutal thud echoing as the two bodies collided and slammed into the porch floor. The wolf was nearly 3 times Malakai's size, but the fox fought with the cold precision of a protector who had everything to lose. He planted himself directly in front of the startled Koda. His fur bristled and his back arched into a bow. A low, vibrating growl, the sound of death itself, erupted from the fox's chest. The wolf looked into Malakai's eyes blazing with the certainty of one willing to die for his ground, and realized it had chosen the wrong opponent. It tucked its tail and fled back into the white abyss of the forest. When Elias finally reached the porch, his hands shaking, he found Malakai standing guard. The fox's shoulder was bleeding, a dark blossom of red against the wood, but he didn't care about the wound. He turned back only to check on Koda. Koda, finally stirring, sniffed the air and smelled the metallic tang of blood. With his clouded vision, he recognized the large silver shape standing before him. Koda leaned forward and gently licked the wound on Malakai's shoulder, a wordless thank you from the protected to the protector. Elias knelt beside them, realizing that the fox had not stayed for the food or the warmth. He had stayed because he had found a soul to honor. As the weeks of the Great Freeze bled into one another, Elias began to document the miracles occurring under his roof. He found an old, leather-bound journal in a trunk and started filling page after page with observations of the extraordinary relationship unfolding in his home. He wrote about the morning he saw Malakai gently wake Koda by touching his nose to the old dog's notched ear, the only spot where Koda might still sense the vibration of a companion's presence. He described the evening when the fox brought back a live grasshopper from a thawed patch near the hearth and released it slowly in front of Koda, giving him the thrill of a chase without the exhaustion of a real hunt. The declaration of protection. From the day of the wolf attack, Malakai changed completely. He was no longer just a visitor. He became a living fortress. He began performing a ritual that Elias could only describe as drawing a line in the frost. Each morning, the silver fox circled the cabin, rubbing his cheeks and marking his scent on every place Koda had once claimed as his own in his prime. The old spruce tree, the porch posts, and the perimeter of the woodpile. This was not an act of conquest, but a declaration to the forest itself. This territory is under my protection now. Any who cross this line will pay the price. Malakai even changed the way he slept. He no longer curled up for comfort. Instead, he lay in a sphinx-like pose at the threshold of the door, his ears rotating constantly like radar, scanning the darkness even with his eyes closed. He had sacrificed his own restful sleep in exchange for absolute security for his friend. The caregiver's intuition. The bond deepened as Malakai became increasingly attuned to Koda's physical needs, often anticipating them before the old dog realized what he required. When Koda's water bowl ran dry, Malakai would nudge the metal dish with his nose until it clattered against the floor, alerting Elias to refill it. When Koda struggled to reach his favorite sunny spot because of fallen debris, Malakai would use his lean body to sweep aside branches or stray pieces of firewood to clear the path. Elias watched in awe as Malakai displayed moments of pure tenderness that seemed to defy wild instinct. One morning, he found a fox carefully arranging soft moss and dry grass he had scavenged from beneath the snow, tucking it into Koda's wicker basket to create a more comfortable nest for the dog's aching, arthritic joints. During a particularly brutal cold snap, Malakai refused to go outside for his patrol until Elias had placed an extra heavy quilt over Koda's sleeping form. The fox had become a nurse and a devoted companion who measured his own comfort by the well-being of his elderly friend. The last hunt of the king. The most remarkable event occurred in late March, when a single snow bunting, the first herald of the approaching spring, landed on the porch rail. In his youth, Koda had lived for bird-watching, sitting for hours and chirping at the finches and ravens that visited the cabin. Now blind and deaf, that joy seemed lost forever. Yet, Malakai found a way. When the bird appeared, Malakai gently took Koda's scruff in his mouth, the way a mother cat carries a kitten, and helped him steady his weight. He guided Koda to the porch rail and positioned himself behind the dog, acting as a living brace to keep the old king steady and safe. Koda could not see the bird clearly or hear its song, but he could detect the flutter of wings and the movement in his peripheral vision. For 10 precious minutes, Koda was young again, a hunter on his perch, his tail twitching with a spark of excitement that hadn't been seen in years. When the bird finally flew away, Malakai helped Koda return to his warm basket, but the light in the dog's eyes did not fade. Elias wept as he recorded this in his journal that night. He understood that he was witnessing love in its purest form, uncomplicated by words, expressed entirely through presence and sacrifice. But as the calendar turned, he also knew that time was running out. Koda's strength was draining away like sand through an hourglass, and the Silver Guardian seemed to know it best of all. Time in the Yukon wilderness does not move by the clock, but by the slow, heavy heartbeat of the land. As the record-breaking winter deepened, the sand in Koda's hourglass began to slip away with terrifying speed. The once mighty German shepherd could no longer rise on his own, his legs having surrendered completely to the weight of his years. He lay motionless in his basket beside the hearth, his breathing becoming labored and uneven, a shallow whisper against the roar of the mountain winds. The hunger of devotion. Malakai seemed to understand that time was running out with a clarity that surpassed even Elias's intuition. The silver fox, usually a creature of calculated survival, underwent a transformation. He refused to go out and hunt for 3 straight days, neglecting his own needs entirely. He remained tethered to Koda's side, refusing to eat or drink, his golden eyes never leaving the old dog's face. When the tremors of pain racked Koda's fragile body, Malakai did not retreat. He pressed his thick, silver charcoal fur firmly against Koda's flank, sharing his warmth and releasing a steady, continuous chittering vibration to calm him. Sometimes, when Koda's breathing would stall for several agonizing seconds, a visible panic would seize the fox. Malakai would place a small, delicate paw on Koda's chest, pressing rhythmically as if he were trying to pump his own wild life force back into the dog's tired heart. The impossible choice. The silence in the cabin was broken only by the crackle of the fire when the local bush veterinarian finally made the arduous trek through the snow to examine Koda. The diagnosis was as cold as the frost on the windows. Koda's kidneys were failing, his heart was enlarged, and at 14 years old, his body was simply worn out. The vet looked at the syringe in his bag, offering to end Koda's suffering and let him slip away in a painless sleep. Elias looked down at the rug. He saw Koda's head resting on Malakai's shoulder, the dog's tail giving a faint, almost invisible wag at the scent of the fox. Despite the discomfort, Koda looked peaceful, anchored by the presence of the silver shadow. "Let him go naturally," Elias whispered, his voice thick with grief. "Let him go here, in his home, surrounded by the only family he has left." The lullaby of the wild. That night was the longest of Elias's life. He sat in his chair, watching the firelight dance across the faces of the 2 animals. Malakai's devotion was unwavering. He groomed Koda's face with infinite gentleness, smoothing down the fur that had become matted with age. The fox remained a warm, vibrating presence, a silent promise whispered into the darkness. "You will not die alone. I am here. I will always be here." Koda's breathing grew shallower as the hours passed toward midnight. His face remained remarkably relaxed, free of the fear that often haunts the end of life. On that late winter night, as the embers in the hearth dwindled to a soft orange glow, Koda took his final breath. He passed quietly, his head resting on the silver fox's foreleg, as if he were simply drifting into a beautiful dream of chasing caribou across the summer tundra. The final act of service. The room fell into a sacred silence. Malakai did not move immediately. He remained perfectly still, his nose pressed against Koda's, waiting for a breath that would not come. Then, slowly, the fox lifted his head and offered a final Eskimo kiss, touching his nose to Koda's one last time. As Elias wept silently in the corner, Malakai began to groom Koda for the final time. He carefully cleaned the old dog's ears and face, performing a final act of service and love. When the work was done, the fox stepped back and looked at Elias. His amber eyes held a profound sadness, but also a sense of resolution. He had kept his promise. He had seen the king to his rest. Without a sound, Malakai turned toward the door. Elias understood that the fox needed to grieve in the wild spaces where he belonged. He opened the door, and the silver guardian disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness, leaving Elias alone with the memory of a bond that had defied every law of nature. The morning after Koda passed, the Yukon sky was a bruised purple, heavy with the promise of more snow. Elias Thorne did not rest. His joints ached with a fire of their own, but he refused to let Koda remain inside the cabin. He carried the old dog wrapped in his favorite heavy quilt out to the towering spruce tree that stood at the edge of the property, the spot where Koda had spent his younger years guarding the perimeter. The ground was partially frozen, making the work of digging an agonizing struggle. Elias labored for hours, using the physical exertion to channel the hollow grief in his chest. As he packed down the final mound of earth and placed heavy river stones atop it to ward off scavengers, the snow began to fall again, soft, silent flakes that covered the fresh grave like a white funeral shroud. The eternal vigil. Elias returned to the cabin to fetch a small wooden marker he had carved, but when he stepped back onto the porch, his breath caught in his throat. Malakai had returned. The silver fox did not approach Elias. He walked slowly, his movements deliberate and solemn, toward the fresh mound of earth. When he reached the grave, Malakai sat down, becoming utterly still. Snow settled over his charcoal and silver fur, turning him into a shimmering statue amid the frozen forest. The fox remained there for an entire day and a night, performing a final sacred vigil. He guarded Koda's eternal rest, ensuring that no predator or scavenger dared to cross the invisible boundary his presence created. Elias brought out a bowl of water and scraps of meat, placing them nearby, but Malakai did not touch them. His focus was absolute. His commitment to his friend was unwavering even in death. The final farewell. At dawn on the second day, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the spruce needles and melted the frost on Malakai's shoulders, the fox finally stood. He stretched long and slow, shaking off the snow and shedding the weight of his grief. He approached the grave one last time, pressing his paw into the cold earth in a final gesture of farewell. Before disappearing into the trees, Malakai paused and looked back at the cabin window where Elias stood. The fox blinked slowly, a gesture of profound affection and trust offered by a free soul to the human who had sheltered them both. Then, with a flicker of his silver tail, he vanished into the deep forest, returning to the wild that had lent him to the cabin for a season. The gift in the thaw. Spring arrived in the Yukon with an unusual gentleness that year. As the snow melted, revealing the earth in stages, Elias visited the grave every morning to speak to his old friend about the birds returning to the valley. One morning, 3 weeks after the burial, Elias noticed something gleaming on the fresh green grass growing over the grave. It was a long, radiant pheasant feather, its colors shimmering in the morning sun. Elias knelt down, his hands trembling as he picked it up. The quill was still damp with dew, freshly placed in the night. Elias understood then that Malakai had returned under the cover of darkness, not to stand guard, but to leave a final gift for the hunter who could no longer hunt. The realization brought Elias to his knees as he clutched the feather to his chest and wept, not tears of sadness, but of gratitude for having witnessed a creature choose loyalty over freedom. The guardian of memories. 5 years passed. Elias grew too frail to manage the cabin alone, and eventually his daughter came to take him to live with her family in the town. On his last day, as he locked the heavy cedar door for the final time, he looked up toward the high ridge overlooking the valley. There, silhouetted against the setting sun, sat a large, regal silver fox. He was older now, his muzzle graying and his movements slower, but his posture remained that of a sentinel. Elias raised his hand in a silent goodbye. The fox blinked slowly in return, and both turned away to walk into the next chapters of their lives. The cabin eventually returned to the forest, but the spruce tree remained strong, its roots entwined with the memory of a bond that defied every natural law. Hikers who pass through the area still tell stories of a silver shadow that sits beneath the tree on moonlit nights, watching over something sacred that only he can see. They walk away changed, touched by the silent lesson Malakai left behind, that true nobility is found in how strength is used to protect what is fragile and honor what is old.